Now, evaporative emissions is all about fuel evaporating. So of course you get emissions out the tailpipe from running your engine. But if you just have a gas tank that vents to the atmosphere, that's not a sealed system, gas will eventually evaporate into a vapor and it'll just go into the atmosphere. That's bad for the EPA. It's also bad for your gas mileage. So that's why, engineers have a, I would say, convoluted system of hoses and pipes and different devices that allow fuel to evaporate normally, but then get contained and stay within the hoses. And it can just be trapped and contained and burnt, and it can go through a charcoal canister to kind of clean the vapors before venting any pressure to the atmosphere. So when you have a leak, it just means that it's venting to the atmosphere somewhere. So it's usually a dry rotted hose, or it could be like a solenoid valve or the charcoal canister that could be leaking. But this scanner has an Evap system test, so I'm going to run it, and it says evaporative system leak test failed. So the way that this works is just sending a signal through the ECU and the computer, and it's causing it to trigger the solenoid, which would then seal the system and make sure that it's not venting into the intake of the engine. And so this is saying that it's not holding pressure. So it can be any sort of, like I said, rubber hose dry rotting and leaking. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at this. I'm not going to claim to be an expert at evaporative emission systems and diagnosing them, but generally speaking, this is an evaporative emissions valve, and it's got a hose that goes over into the intake. And so when this valve opens up, it allows fuel vapors to get ingested through the intake, and it just gets burnt through the normal combustion process. This hose comes over here. There is a diagnostic port where you can hook up like a vacuum type system to hold vacuum and see where it's leaking. But this goes to some hard lines, and it goes underneath the vehicle to the frame rail back to the fuel tank. And so there's no clear signs of leaks or problems on these hoses. Theoretically, it could be this valve, but there is a bunch of rubber hoses behind the vehicle near the fuel tank. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at those. So over behind the right rear tire, you've got this device. I'm not going to pretend like I know what all of these components are. I don't know if that's the carbon canister or something, but what's of especially importance is you can see rubber hoses that could potentially be dry rotting and allowing fuel vapors to evaporate. And just look around, and in my case, I've got two dry rotted hoses right here that need to be replaced. So I kind of cheated. I actually took my truck to Firestone and I let them do a smoke test, which is where you just pump smoke into the system and then you seal it up on either end, and you look and see where the smoke escapes. They identified these two rubber hoses as the source of the leak. So I'm going to go ahead and patch this up with some generic fuel hose, and I can reuse these clamps, and I'm hoping that this will take care of that check engine light. We'll see. So I'm going to see if I can actually do this with the camera in the way. It's a little bit of an awkward reach, but I can already tell this is going to be a pain in the ass with these rubber hoses. Might be easier to take a razor blade, honestly, and just cut the rubber out. So I got the clamps out of the way. The clamps kind of look broken, but I'll try a razor blade to kind of cut the rubber and relieve it. They're stuck on there really good. They're really brittle and dry rotted. So since this is such a short stubby hose, I'm going to try a different approach, which is move the clamps onto the hard line to allow me to move the rubber out of the way. And that clamp has broken off, so I'm going to need new clamps now. Yay. So I got this hose out, had to cut it up a little bit, but you can see it definitely dry rotted, definitely had cracks through it. But these spring clamps, these are old and they've got to go. You see this one had the tabs break off just from trying to squeeze it open, had to Dremel it off. So it looks like 3/8 fuel line, or sometimes called PCV hose, is the right size. And honestly, now that I'm looking at it, it would probably be better to go ahead and take this hose off before putting this one back on, so that way I've got some more flexibility here. So I'll get these hose clamps out of the way. And I'm back to dremeling to get these hose clamps off. They're so brittle and weak that you end up just breaking the tabs off and then you can't spring them open. And I'm going to have to cut this clamp off too. You don't need to see 10 minutes of dremeling, but you get the picture. It's just a pain to work in. And I'm hoping that these two hoses were the only ones that are leaking, because if you look around, hose there, look up above where the spare tire are, there's hoses here. I mean, that one looks pretty dry rotted. More hoses, more hoses, more hoses. There's rubber hoses everywhere. But this is the area that you want to be looking for if you do have some type of evaporative emissions leak. Well, you can see this hose is completely separating. There it goes. Definitely already dry rotted and leaking. And had to cut all of those clamps off. So got to get some fuel line rated hose. I'll clean up the fittings, put some RTV on them, clamp them up, and it should be good. This is one of those tasks that's annoying because it's not overly difficult or hard to figure out how to do it. It just comes down to cramped working conditions and trying to get things, to go together. So you don't need to see me struggle with this, but basically put the 3/8 fuel line hose on the fittings, clamp them up, and I need to move the camera so I can get better access. Honestly, the fastest way that I figured out to do this is the cordless ratchet. Makes it easy and faster, so you don't have to keep reorienting your screwdriver. And I'll do the final tightening with the screwdriver. Well, that should do it for those two hoses. I'll go ahead and redo the evaporative emissions leak test with the scanner and see if that makes a difference on whether it passes or fails. I'm going to run the engine, pull up the leak test on here, and see if it passes now. So, evap system test. Please, hopefully this will work. Nope, it failed. Well, I guess I'll have to wait and see if the check engine light comes back on again, but those were the only two rubber hoses that Firestone pointed out. And I've never actually used the leak test on this device before, so I don't even know if it's actually executing it properly. So I'll just have to test drive it and see. But again, if you have any type of evaporative emissions leak check engine light code, look at all of those rubber hoses behind the fuel tank underneath the rear bumper. Especially when you get to 15, 16, 17, 20-year-old vehicles, almost every hose is going to start leaking something. So it can be a little frustrating to keep up with it, but hopefully this will clear it up. Thanks for watching. Comment below if you have questions or suggestions for future videos.